Arjun Erigaisi is on a tear lately. He just reached 2809 ELO, a level that is almost unheard of in the chess world. So with that in mind, in this video to honor Arjun, we are looking at one of his best games versus his fellow Indian superstar Praggnanandhaa, and this game did take place on October 16, 2024 in the WR Masters Tournament. And here we go. In the game, Praggnanandhaa opens 1d4. Arjun goes knight to f6, the Indian defense. Very good choice for this game. Now c4, and here in this position, the main line for black at the highest level is going to be e6, intending either a Nimzo Indian or a Queen's Gambit decline. But instead, in the game, Arjun goes for the most combative idea. That is g6, intending either a King's Indian defense or a Grunfeld with the move d5. Now here, Praggnanandhaa, the main line is knight to c3, of course, but instead, in the game, he does go for a much more aggressive idea. That is the move 3f3, and this is a very popular anti-Grunfeld idea. Now here, in this position, if black goes bishop g7, then e4 will be the move, clamping down on that d5 square. Therefore, the Grunfeld with the move d5 won't be possible. However, on the other hand, if black does go d5 right away, then you take on d5, the knight takes, then you go e4, driving back the knight, and there is no knight on c3 to trade for. And that, of course, is the main idea of the Grunfeld. So here, Arjun, how does he want to counter this? Well, d5 and bishop g7 are both playable. However, instead in the game, he does play arguably the strongest move, at least according to modern engines. That is the Modern Benoni move, c5, expanding on the queenside and challenging white's pawn on d4. Now here, you don't want to allow c takes d4, and you also don't want to go d takes c5. That would be a very weak move. That would allow black to equalize very fast. So instead here, Praggnanandhaa, d5 is the move, expanding in the center, and now Arjun does clamp down on that pawn on d5 immediately with the very strong move e6 in the sphere of the Modern Benoni. Now black here, his plan is simple. E takes d5, then bishop g7, d6, castles, and so on. Now here, Praggnanandhaa, e4, expanding in the center. Of course, e takes d5 is not the idea after e takes. Instead, c takes d5 will be the move. Now here, Arjun, d6, knight to c3, e takes, and c takes. And this is perhaps the real starting point of this variation. Of course, Arjun will go bishop g7. And now here, Praggnanandhaa, he has many different moves he can play. He has to find the right arrangement for his pieces. Now, real fast, to go down the list, white here can go bishop g5, bishop b3, knight to e2, even bishop d3. All these moves are playable. They all lead to slightly different setups. But overall, the main plan for Praggnanandhaa in this position is perhaps bishop g5 or bishop e3, queen d2, maybe knight e2, and then knight g3, bishop b2, and short castles. Ideas like that. Of course, these pawns on d5, e4, and f3 make a very strong impression, but they do stop that knight from going to f3, therefore his development will be a little bit cumbersome in the game. Now here in the game, Praggnanandhaa, bishop e3 is the move, a perfectly fine idea. The idea being queen d2 and then perhaps bishop h6 at some point, try to trade off the very good bishop on g7 of Arjun. Now Arjun, short castles, queen d2, and a6, threatening b5. Of course, Praggnanandhaa does not want to allow that. He goes a4 in the sphere of the Modern Benoni opening once again. And now here, Arjun, it is his turn to find a plan. Now in this position, in this line with bishop e3 and queen d2 from Praggnanandhaa, he has many different good moves. For example, rook e8, queen to a5, h5, knight d7, and so on are all playable. But instead, in the game, Arjun plays a move that is almost never played at the highest level in this position. He simply goes queen to c7, and this move is a little bit strange. You are committing the queen to c7 very early. It wasn't necessary to do that. For example, rook to e8 may have been a slightly more flexible move. The rook always belongs on e8, but it's not always clear if the queen does belong on c7. So here, Arjun, he's basically playing an unusual move to get Praggnanandhaa out of his preparation for this game. Now here, Praggnanandhaa, he plays a very aggressive move, bishop h6, immediately trying to trade off those dark squared bishops. Of course, this being the idea of bishop e3 and queen d2 on the prior moves. Now here, Arjun, he does have the option of taking on h6. Bishop takes h6 is a perfectly fine move. However, he can also ignore it and go, say, knight d7 or rook to e8, allowing bishop takes g7. Either option is perfectly fine. In the game, Arjun does take on h6. Bishop takes h6 is the move. Then we have queen takes h6. And then here, Arjun, again, many different moves available. In the game, he does go rook to e8, a perfectly fine move. The rook is perfectly placed on e8, challenging the white pawn on e4, stopping ideas like f4, for example. Now here, Praggnanandhaa, it's time for him to commit to the next phase of his plan, and he has two main ideas. One is you can slow play the position, just develop and castle. For example, knight g to e2, intending knight c1, bishop e2, and castles is fine. You can also just retreat the queen, queen d2, getting the queen back to the center of the board. You have achieved your goal of getting rid of those dark squared bishops, therefore queen d2 is just fine. But Praggnanandhaa, he is just as much of a madman as Arjun Erigaisi. These are perhaps two of the most aggressive players in the world today, especially at the highest level. So here, Praggnanandhaa, of course, he goes for the more aggressive option, h4, expanding on the king side, potentially threatening h5 on the next move. His plan is simple. He wants to open up that h-file and then threaten checkmate on h7 at some point in the future. All right, Arjun, how does he deal with this threat? In the game, knight b to d7 is the move, a very important move, threatening knight to e5 in certain lines. And now Praggnanandhaa, it turns out h5 right away does not work. Then Arjun does go knight to e5 immediately. And even if you do take on g6, h takes, then f takes is the move. And that pawn on h7 is defended twice by the knight and the queen on c7. Therefore, Arjun will be doing relatively fine. So with that in mind here, Praggnanandhaa, he plays a much more prudent idea, knight g to e2. Now, the idea being e2 is the best square for the knight, and in the future, you can go to, say, g3 or c1 and so on, and continue developing. Now, Arjun, rook b8 on the board, threatening b5 soon. Of course, knight to e2 does block in that bishop on f1. Therefore, b5 is a real threat. You only have the knight and that pawn clamping down on b5. You also need that bishop on c1, or f1, sorry, being active as well to stop b5. So Praggnanandhaa here, what will he do about this idea of b5 from Arjun? Well, he ignores it, and he plays the much stronger idea, h5, finally advancing that alpha 0 pawn all the way down the board. Now here, Arjun, what's it going to be? Do you want to take on h5 or do something else? Well, turns out taking on h5 is a massive mistake. Then the move for Praggnanandhaa will be g4, gaining space on the king side, driving back the knight, and potentially threatening ideas like f4 and g5 in the future. That would be very, very good for Praggnanandhaa. Trust me on that. Instead here, Arjun, he finds the strongest move, knight to e5, jumping in with the knight. Now the idea being, once again, if h takes g6, then f takes g6 will be the move, and both the knight on f6 and the queen on c7 do defend the very weak h7 pawn. However, here, Praggnanandhaa, he does get what he wants. That pawn is on h5. Now he just goes knight to h3, defending that pawn with the knight. Now if knight takes, then knight takes is the response for Praggnanandhaa. And again, his attack continues. That alpha 0 pawn on h6 will be there for at least a little while. Arjun Erigaisi, for now, he is defending sufficiently on the king side, but he does have to get his queen side play going and get it going fast. Otherwise, Praggnanandhaa will continue building up the attack on the king side. So with that in mind, how is he going to get his play going on the queen side? In the game, he does go queen d7, a curious move, getting the queen closer to the defense of the king. For example, queen to f8 is now a very real threat. However, instead of that, the computer does love the idea of c4, gaining space on the queen side and blocking the bishop's access to the b5 square. Therefore, b5 would be an immediate threat. So c4, the key engine line, but instead queen to e7 with that resource queen to f8 in the future is the move for Arjun. Now here, Praggnanandhaa, bishop e2 is the move, continuing development, and now perhaps short castle may be a move in the future, or it could also go king to f2, artificially castling the king. Now Arjun, he does find the idea of c4 on this move, c4 gaining space, and now, of course, the bishop cannot access b5. Therefore, b5 is an immediate threat. That pawn on b5 would be defended properly by the rook on b8. The knight cannot take it. Now here, Praggnanandhaa, how does he want to continue? He's a very difficult choice in this position. I mean, b5 is being threatened. You can stop it with the move a5. However, there, Arjun can go b5 anyway, gaining space on the queen side and allowing a takes, then rook takes. Now, instead of that, the computer, as usual, finds a diabolical idea in the spirit of alpha 0. Here, the move is queen to e3. Retreating the queen, you allow b5, then you take on b5, and then go h6, the alpha 0 pawn going all the way to h6, and then the idea is black always has to worry about those back rank mating threats throughout the entire game, and you can shift your focus to the queen side. Now that would have been the strongest idea. Instead, a5 is the move for Praggnanandhaa, a decent move, stopping b5, or so it seems, but here Arjun, he goes b5 anyway, b5 on the board, and now the drawback of this move, of course, white can capture that pawn en passant. If you're a beginner, whenever a pawn moves 2 squares forward next to another pawn, for example, b5 here, you can recapture with the other pawn on the diagonal. So Praggnanandhaa, a takes b6 is the move, recapturing en passant, and now rook takes b6, recaptures, and the rook is very active on the b file. For example, that pawn on b2 right now is vulnerable. Arjun is threatening rook takes b2. Well, here Praggnanandhaa has a few different options. For example, rook to a2 is playable. You can also go knight to d1, defending with the knight, and queen d2 is also a decent move. In the game, rook to a2 is the move for Praggnanandhaa, very creative. Now Arjun, bishop d7, developing the bishop. Now here, short castles on the board for Praggnanandhaa. Rook e to b8 for Arjun. Arjun again piling up pressure on that pawn on b2. And here Praggnanandhaa, he actually ignores the threat and just goes rook f to a1, piling up pressure on a6 instead. So Praggnanandhaa abandoning the defense of that pawn on b2, instead counterattacking on the a6 square. Now here Arjun, what's it going to be? Do you want to take on b2 or do something else? In the game, Arjun, he does defend that pawn on a6 with the bishop c8, creative move. I mean, he just went bishop d7 on the couple moves prior. However, the idea being bishop d7, that opens up the rook's access to the queen side. Then you go rook e to b8, and then bishop c8 again, and the rook is not blocked on the king side, is now on the queen side. So very creative by Arjun. Of course, there were other ideas. The computer loved knight takes h5 in that position, but that is a story for another day. All right, here, Praggnanandhaa, knight to d1 is the move. Defending that pawn on b2 with the knight. Now, rook takes b2 is not possible. All right, here, Arjun, again, knight takes h5 is the top engine line. But instead, knight f to d7 is the move in the game. And now that knight is rerouting potentially to the c5 square. Knight to c5 would be the move. And that would be an excellent square for the knight. All right, here, Praggnanandhaa, he finally opens up that h file. H takes g6 is the move. H takes, then f takes, and then rook to c1. That pawn on c4 is now vulnerable once again. The pawn on b2 being defended by the knight. Therefore, bishop takes c4 is now a real threat by Praggnanandhaa. And here, Arjun, he does respect the threat. He doesn't have to. He can go, say, knight to c5 or queen to f6 and so on. Instead, in the game, rook to b4, he does defend. And here, Praggnanandhaa, once again, he has to find a good way to untangle his pieces. Again, these pawns on d5, e4, and f3 do make a very good impression. They are very strong. But the one drawback of this 3f3 line against the King's Indian and Grunfeld, again, if black does go for the Modern Benoni, your pieces are sort of tripping over each other. So with that in mind here, Praggnanandhaa, what's it going to be? Well, the computer loves the idea of knight to f1 and then knight d2, a very creative path for the knight. Instead, in the game, rook to c2, defending once again with the two rooks, defending that pawn on b2. Now here, Arjun, knight c5, jumping in with the knight. Again, that knight is just wonderfully placed on the c5 square. And Praggnanandhaa, knight to e3 is the move. Now that knight does put pressure on that pawn on c4. Therefore, knight takes or bishop takes is a threat. All right, Arjun, queen to f6. Increasing pressure with the queen on this diagonal here. Interesting idea. And now Praggnanandhaa, he spots the one drawback of this move. If you like puzzles, pause the video and try to find the key idea here for Praggnanandhaa. All right, here, in this position, the idea, you actually jump up with the knight, knight to h5, and the idea being that pawn on g6 is currently being pinned as the queen on f6 would be hanging. So if g takes, then queen takes f6 would win the queen on the spot. Therefore, g takes h5 is not a possibility. So with that in mind here, Arjun, he simply has to move the queen. In the game, queen e7 is the move. There were other squares. Queen to f8 and queen h8 were also playable. Now Praggnanandhaa, knight to g3, jumping back with the knight. That move was not necessary. You could continue the attack with the immediate f4, but here Praggnanandhaa is offering a draw by repetition. Arjun does start to go for it. Queen to f6, then knight h5 for Praggnanandhaa. Once again, queen to e7 for Arjun. And now here Praggnanandhaa, if he wanted a draw, knight to g3 and queen to f6 would be a draw by threefold repetition. Now, instead of that here, Praggnanandhaa, he does go for the attack. The strongest move is f4, gaining space on the king side. Now, this move f4 is very, very committal. You are decreasing the defense of that pawn on e4. I mean, now, that pawn on e4 is actually hanging. So whenever you go f4 in this structure, in this 3f3 anti-Grunfeld line, you are basically going all in for the attack immediately. Now here, this position is just absolutely bonkers. Arjun has many different ideas. The computer loves the idea of taking that free knight on h5, g takes h5, allowing f takes e5, then something like queen takes, and then perhaps the trade of queens, queen takes h5, and bishop takes. So overall, g takes h5 is the top engine line. The engine also likes the idea of knight takes e4, basically sacrificing that knight on e5. Then after f takes e5, you do recapture with the queen, making it an official knight sacrifice. Instead of that, in the game, Arjun, he does go knight e to d3, preserving that knight from the e5 square. However, this does allow Praggnanandhaa to preserve his knight on h5 if he wants to. However, instead of that, he does take on c4. Knight takes c4. This does decrease the defense of that knight on d3. For example, bishop d3 could be a threat now. Now Arjun, he does take on h5. G takes h5. Praggnanandhaa is officially down a piece in this position. He's down that knight. He has to attack. Now here, the top engine line is rook to a3, putting pressure on that knight on d3 with the rook, and intending perhaps rook g3 check if the knight moves. Instead, knight takes d6 is the move for Praggnanandhaa, jumping in with the knight. Now here, Arjun obviously cannot take that knight on d6 with the queen. The knight is defended by the other queen on h6. Therefore, instead, he finds a very strong move, bishop g4, flying in with the bishop, threatening bishop takes e2 as that bishop on e2 is currently hanging. All right, Praggnanandhaa, bishop takes d3, trading the bishop for the knight. We have knight takes, and then rook takes a6. Praggnanandhaa, the rook on a6, is now incredibly active. For example, if Arjun takes on b2, rook takes, then rook takes, for example, that would leave the back rank undefended. Rook to a8 would be devastating. So here, Arjun, what's it going to be in this position? Well, the computer finds a couple of ideas. Queen to h4 is one move, and it turns out you can go rook takes b2 if you follow it correctly. For example, rook takes, then knight takes, does keep that rook on b8, covering the back rank. That would be playable. Instead here, Arjun Erigaisi, he makes a big mistake. He takes on b2 with the knight, knight takes b2, and it turns out this is a very significant blunder. Here the computer, as you can see by the eval bar on the left, just skyrocketing for Praggnanandhaa. Here Praggnanandhaa has a just devastating idea, and it's not even that complicated. And if you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to find the key idea for Praggnanandhaa in this position. And while you're at it, if you're enjoying this video, go and smash that YouTube like button for me. Thank you so much for doing that. Well, the key idea here for Praggnanandhaa, of course, is going to be f5, threatening f6. If Praggnanandhaa can get that pawn all the way to the f6 square, that would be absolutely devastating. The threats would be insane on the king side. And it turns out, almost no matter what Arjun does, if Praggnanandhaa did go f5, then f6 would be the follow-up move. Trust me on that. You can investigate it on your own if you want to. However, instead, in the game, Praggnanandhaa, he did not go f5. That was the key idea. Again, he'd be nearly winning there. Instead, queen to g5 was the move, and this move basically lets Arjun bail out to an equal endgame. Here, both sides did agree to a draw. The idea being after queen takes, then f takes, you do have an equal endgame on the board. Praggnanandhaa would have those 4 pawns versus the 2 of Arjun, but Arjun Erigaisi would have the extra bishop in this position. That means overall, the game would be roughly level, and both players did agree to a draw in this position. Wow, what a game by Praggnanandhaa and Arjun Erigaisi in the 2024 WR Masters Tournament. All right, Chess YouTube, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, smash that like button, and check out this video right here, where Arjun Erigaisi and Gukesh played one of the craziest attacking games you will see all year. That game was incredible. Check it out. I think you're going to love it. And I'll see you in the next video.